There are histories you learn in school and histories that crawl under your skin. This is one of the latter. Imagine a windowless lab. Fluorescent lights hum. Men in white coats write observations into clipboards as a man, drugged and disoriented, stares into the distance. He does not know he's being watched. He does not know the pills were slipped into his coffee. He does not know the experiment is not medicine, but an attempt to take his mind apart and put it back together in a way that will obey. Now, imagine those labs are not in some distant authoritarian country, but scattered across North America. Imagine the orders came from the intelligence agency of a nation that, in public, claims to protect liberty. This is not a story about science-fictional villainy. This is MKUltra. What began as a frantic scramble to understand the enemy's mind in the early Cold War became, over the course of 2 decades, a sprawling web of experiments funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, experiments that used psychedelics, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and psychological coercion on unwitting subjects. The line between research and abuse blurred. The line between defense and crime disappeared. Why did the CIA do this? Because in the early 1950s, the world felt fragile. The Soviet Union had detonated nuclear weapons. China had fallen to communism. Korean War soldiers returned with stories of brainwashing. In the eyes of America's spy masters, the ultimate weapon was not a bomb, but the ability to break a human mind, or to make it refuse to break. MKUltra, in its clean, bureaucratic title, sounds clinical. In reality, it was messy, secretive, and catastrophic for many. It was hubris in a white coat, and it left scars that a nation still has not fully accounted for. If you want to understand MKUltra, you can't start with a lab notebook or an LSD vial. You have to start with a feeling. Raw, post-war panic dressed up as intelligence doctrine. World War II ended with a tidy story. Democracy triumphed over fascism. But the rubble of Europe held a different narrative, a new rivalry between 2 giant states. Within months of VE Day, Western democracies feared communist conspiracies at home. The battle lines were not just territorial, they were psychological. In that atmosphere, stories of brainwashing took on outsized power. The Korean War produced dramatic cases, captured soldiers who offered propaganda confessions, then returned home with altered loyalties. The concept of coercive persuasion was not new, but suddenly it seemed weaponizable. If an enemy could make someone betray their country, could friendly intelligence make sure friendly operatives couldn't be bent in the same way? Could you build an agent who would not only survive interrogation, but be utterly malleable? Into that landscape marched the newly powerful Central Intelligence Agency. Chartered in 1947, the CIA's mandate was broad: gather intelligence, conduct covert activities, and generally provide the U.S. government with plausible deniability. The agency was staffed with World War II intelligence veterans, people who had seen the brutal effectiveness of propaganda, deception, and psychological operations. They understood that wars could be won and lost in the mind. But their fear grew into an obsession. If Soviet programs or Chinese indoctrination techniques could break people, maybe American intelligence could break the enemy better. Maybe the secret to victory lay not in bullets, but in knowledge of the human psyche. That's where science and secrecy collided. Across the Western world, psychology had become a booming field. Behaviorism, psychoanalysis, and emerging neurobiology offered new models of human behavior. Researchers studied conditioning, memory, reinforcement, and the chemical correlates of consciousness. Governments did not take long to see utility in these disciplines. The CIA began funding research, sometimes overt, often clandestine, into methods of interrogation, mind control, and truth extraction. Initially, the work was framed as defensive. Find out what the enemy knows about brainwashing and develop countermeasures. That made the work defensible in memos and briefings. But defensible in a memo and ethical in practice are two different things. In 1950, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence took an active interest in what they called behavioral modulation. The agency's officers reached out to prominent psychiatrists, neurologists, and research hospitals. They partnered with universities and private foundations. The work was compartmentalized, routed through front organizations, and hidden in the folds of the national security state. And then came the drugs. By all accounts, the CIA's fascination with chemicals that altered perception predated MKUltra. The agency heard rumors that the Soviet Union and China had chemical and biological programs to manipulate populations. It worried about the Soviet use of truth serums or mind-altering substances to extract confessions or create loyal agents. Those rumors, true or not, became justification. By the early 1950s, the CIA had an experimental program that used LSD and other psychotropic drugs as possible tools of interrogation and control. LSD, discovered by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann in 1938, and its effects described later after accidental ingestion, produced dramatic alterations in consciousness, sense of self, and suggestibility. That made it, in the CIA's estimation, an excellent candidate for interrogation use if you could learn how to deploy it reliably. The agency also developed a disturbing philosophical premise. In the lab, a human mind could be deconstructed and rebuilt. The idea sounds like science fiction, but in internal memos, it became a research goal. If you could erase memories, implant new ones, or force compliance through a combination of drugs, electroshock, and sensory control, you could create the perfect agent or the perfect weaponizable method. Those memos were written by real people in suits, in offices that now look painfully ordinary. The bureaucracy made it clinical. The clinical language made it easier to do what was morally indefensible.
And so Project Bluebird was born. Then Artichoke, then MKUltra. Names that sound like vegetables on the surface, but in practice were cover for a metamorphosis of human experimentation. From the start, the CIA relied on external institutions to carry out work it wanted deniable. Universities, hospitals, private companies, and even prisons were funded to test drugs, hypnosis techniques, and extreme conditions on subjects, sometimes volunteers, but often people who had no idea what was being done to them. The agency paid through third parties to hide the trail. The separation was deliberate. The ability to deny was the operational imperative. In the next chapter, we'll follow the money and the men, the psychiatrists who took CIA cash, the doctors who crossed ethical red lines, and the bureaucrats who rationalized it all. We'll travel from sanitized briefing rooms to grim hospital wards, where men and women were experimented on under the logic of national security. Because to understand MKUltra is to understand how a democracy's fear can justify an erosion of its own values. It's a history we should not forget. It was the height of the Cold War. The United States was terrified of communist infiltration, nuclear war, and Soviet spies lurking in the shadows. But behind the curtains of secrecy, the CIA was fighting a very different kind of war, a war for the human mind. The secret program would come to be known as MKUltra, a sprawling network of experiments, safe houses, and shadow labs that tested the limits of psychology, pharmacology, and human ethics. At its core, MKUltra asked a single question: could the mind be controlled? The answers they found and the methods they used would shock the world for decades to come. The story begins in 1953. Dwight Eisenhower is in the White House. The Korean War has just ended. America is enjoying post-war prosperity. But the CIA is obsessed with one terrifying possibility. What if the Soviets had already cracked the code to mind control? Reports were coming in of American POWs in Korea returning home with strange behavior. Some confessed to crimes they never committed. Others claimed loyalty to communist ideology, as if their minds had been rewritten. The CIA didn't know if this was propaganda, hypnosis, or a terrifying new weapon. But they weren't about to take chances. So, in the spring of 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized an operation so secret, so classified, that almost no one in government knew it existed. The project was given an unassuming, bureaucratic code name, MKUltra.
At the center of this story is a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Soft-spoken, brilliant, and ruthless in his curiosity, Gottlieb became the CIA's poisoner-in-chief. His mission was simple: find a way to control human thought, break the will of enemies, and if possible, erase and rewrite the human mind. But Gottlieb was no ordinary scientist. He had a taste for the bizarre. He believed that if the CIA could master drugs like LSD, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation, they could manufacture the perfect spy, someone who could carry out missions without memory, confess to crimes they never committed, or resist torture indefinitely. Under his guidance, MKUltra would expand into over 150 sub-projects. Some were run through universities, others through secret CIA safe houses. Some experiments were consensual, many were not. MKUltra's reach was staggering. It infiltrated hospitals, prisons, military bases, and even everyday life. Researchers dosed unsuspecting patients with LSD. Prisoners were experimented on like lab rats. And in CIA-run brothels, men were drugged and observed through two-way mirrors, their behavior cataloged like data points in a grotesque experiment. It wasn't science fiction. It was real. It was happening in America, and almost no one outside the program knew it existed.
Once MKUltra was launched, it spread like wildfire inside the CIA. Sidney Gottlieb and his team were given enormous freedom. They had unlimited funding, minimal oversight, and near-total secrecy. That combination allowed them to push boundaries that most scientists wouldn't even dare to imagine. At the heart of MKUltra was a new drug, lysergic acid diethylamide, better known as LSD. First synthesized in Switzerland in 1938, it had been largely ignored until the 1940s, when scientists discovered its powerful hallucinogenic effects. To Gottlieb and the CIA, LSD was more than just a psychedelic. It was a potential weapon. They believed it could be used to shatter the mind, erase memories, or perhaps even unlock hidden powers. So the agency bought up the world's supply of LSD. Literally, for a time the CIA had cornered the global market on the drug, and then they began testing it on anyone and everyone. Some experiments involved volunteers who thought they were contributing to science, but far more disturbing were the unwitting subjects. CIA operatives spiked drinks at bars, slipped the LSD into coffee at business meetings, and even dosed each other in the office. In one infamous case, a CIA scientist was secretly given LSD during a retreat without his knowledge. He later spiraled into paranoia and depression. His name was Dr. Frank Olson, and his story would end in tragedy. But Olson's death was just the beginning. Across the country, countless people were subjected to covert dosing. Prisoners, patients in psychiatric wards, even random civilians. Some never knew they had been part of MKUltra until decades later. One of the most bizarre aspects of MKUltra was Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, posing as brothels. Prostitutes, on the CIA payroll, would lure men inside, slip LSD into their drinks, and then watch as their behavior was recorded through two-way mirrors. These experiments weren't just about drugs, they were about control. Gottlieb wanted to know, how do people behave when their reality is chemically altered? How do they react to suggestion, coercion, or interrogation under the influence? The answers were messy. Some test subjects became paranoid and violent. Others broke down completely. And in many cases, the CIA agents themselves were too fascinated with the spectacle to gather meaningful data. What made MKUltra so vast was its spider-web-like structure. Gottlieb funneled money into universities, hospitals, and front organizations. Professors at major institutions, sometimes unknowingly, carried out MKUltra experiments under the guise of academic research. Hypnosis, sensory deprivation, sleep experiments, electroshock, all of these became tools in the quest to manipulate the mind. And in every corner of the program, the guiding principle was the same. The ends justify the means. By the mid-1950s, MKUltra had grown into a monster. It had dozens of subprojects, thousands of participants, and a mountain of classified data. But the question remained, was any of it actually working? The answer would prove complicated and dangerous.
Frank Olson was a brilliant bacteriologist who worked for the U.S. Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. His job was already shadowy. He specialized in biological warfare and had clearance to some of the nation's deepest secrets. In 1953, Olson attended a CIA retreat at a cabin in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. It was meant to be a gathering of scientists and spooks. Drinks were poured, jokes were made, but one glass on the table contained something extra. A few drops of LSD slipped in by none other than Sidney Gottlieb. Olson had been chosen as an unwitting test subject. At first, the results seemed mild. Olson was disoriented, unsettled, but nothing out of the ordinary for someone on their first acid trip. But in the days that followed, his behavior shifted dramatically. He became anxious, depressed. He spoke of feeling like he was losing his mind. He told colleagues he had made a mistake by joining the CIA's programs. He confided to his wife that he wanted to quit his job. This wasn't just paranoia. Olson had seen things in his work that most Americans couldn't imagine. Chemical interrogations, extreme experiments, and covert operations that blurred the line between science and torture. Now, under the influence of LSD and the stress of secrecy, he was questioning it all. For the CIA, that made him a liability. On the night of November 28, 1953, Olson checked in to the Statler Hotel in New York City with a CIA handler. He was supposed to undergo psychiatric evaluation. Instead, in the early hours of the morning, Olson plunged from the 13th floor window to his death. The official story was suicide, a man overcome with stress and paranoia who leapt to his death in despair. But for decades, his family never accepted that explanation. In 1975, more than 20 years after Olson's death, a bombshell dropped. The Rockefeller Commission, an investigation into CIA abuses, revealed that Frank Olson had been secretly dosed with LSD just days before his death. The Olson family was stunned. They had never been told the truth. President Gerald Ford personally invited them to the White House to apologize, and they received a financial settlement, but the details remained murky. Was Olson's death a suicide triggered by LSD, or was it something darker, an execution disguised as an accident? In the 1990s, Olson's body was exhumed for forensic analysis. The results were chilling. The medical examiner found evidence of blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a blow delivered before the fall. This suggested Olson had been knocked unconscious and thrown out of the window, a classic assassination tactic. If true, it meant that the CIA had silenced one of their own scientists to protect the secrecy of MKUltra. Frank Olson's death became one of the most infamous scandals tied to MKUltra. It exposed the program to the world, and it raised a question that would haunt the CIA for decades. How many other stories, how many other lives had been buried under the weight of secrecy?
While LSD was the centerpiece of MKUltra, it wasn't the only tool in the CIA's psychological arsenal. Sidney Gottlieb believed that true mind control would require more than just chemicals. the program began branching out, exploring hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and even combinations of all three. The idea was simple. If you could break a person down completely, strip away their sense of self, then maybe you could rebuild them into something new. Hypnosis had long been viewed with suspicion, somewhere between parlor trick and legitimate science. But to the CIA, it represented possibility. Could a hypnotized subject be programmed to carry out orders they would otherwise refuse? Could they be made to forget entire conversations or confess to crimes they didn't commit? CIA documents later revealed experiments where hypnotized subjects were instructed to perform dangerous or humiliating tasks. Some complied, others resisted, but the agency concluded that hypnosis alone wasn't reliable enough. Still, combined with drugs like LSD, it seemed more promising. Under the influence, subjects became more suggestible, more pliable, and that was exactly what the CIA was looking for. Another avenue was sensory deprivation. Scientists built isolation tanks where subjects floated in warm salt water, cut off from sound and light. The goal was to see what happened to the human mind when deprived of external input. The results were disturbing. Within hours, subjects reported anxiety, hallucinations, and a distorted sense of time. After prolonged isolation, some broke down completely, unable to distinguish reality from imagination. To Gottlieb, this was valuable data. If isolation could break a person's mental defenses, then it might be used in interrogations or reprogramming. Perhaps the darkest of all were the electroshock experiments. Hospitals and psychiatric wards, sometimes unknowingly funded by the CIA, delivered extreme electroconvulsive therapy to patients. The shocks were not the mild treatments used in medicine today. They were massive jolts of electricity, repeated over and over, sometimes hundreds of times. The goal was to wipe the mind clean, erase memories, and leave behind a blank slate. In Montreal, a psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron conducted some of the most infamous of these experiments under a CIA-funded project. His patients came in for minor mental health issues, depression, anxiety, but left with shattered identities, erased memories, and permanent psychological scars. Cameron called it psychic driving. The CIA called it data. The deeper MKUltra went, the more it resembled Frankenstein's laboratory. But instead of sewing together bodies, Gottlieb was sewing together experiments. Hypnosis with drugs, sensory deprivation with electroshock, memory erasure with suggestion. The CIA was trying to build something that had never existed, a human being who could be controlled like a machine. And the question was, had they succeeded? By the late 1950s, MKUltra had grown into a vast and tangled web of subprojects. The CIA had poured millions of dollars into experiments across the country. Some showed promise, many were failures, but the cost in human suffering was undeniable. And yet the program didn't slow down. It expanded. It reached into prisons, universities, even unsuspecting neighborhoods. The search for mind control was far from over.
MKUltra thrived in the shadows. To keep the program secret, the CIA needed test subjects who couldn't fight back, who couldn't expose what was happening to them. They turned to the most vulnerable, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and society's forgotten. Behind locked doors, in cells and hospital wards, the agency found people who could be manipulated without consequence. For the CIA, it was the perfect human laboratory. Across the United States, prisons became test beds for MKUltra research. Inmates were promised lighter sentences, better conditions, or sometimes nothing at all. One of the most infamous cases took place at the Lexington Narcotics Farm in Kentucky. On paper, it was a rehabilitation center for drug addicts. In reality, it was a front for CIA-sponsored experiments. Prisoners and patients were given massive doses of LSD, sometimes daily for weeks at a time. In exchange, they were offered their drug of choice: heroin, morphine, or barbiturates. Addicts, desperate for relief, volunteered, not knowing they were part of a mind control program. The results were devastating. Many left broken, addicted, or psychologically scarred for life. Psychiatric hospitals were another hunting ground. The CIA quietly funneled money into mental institutions, funding doctors willing to push boundaries. Patients with depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia, people already struggling with fragile mental states, were subjected to forced LSD trips, sensory deprivation, and extreme electroshock. In Montreal, Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron's psychic driving experiments went way beyond treatment. He would put patients into drug-induced comas for weeks, bombard them with recorded messages thousands of times a day, and shock their brains with electricity until their personalities fractured. Many never recovered. They lost memories, the ability to speak coherently, even the knowledge of who their family was. Ordinary people entered Cameron's care, and strangers left in their place. MKUltra didn't stop with prisoners and patients. The CIA also targeted people living on society's fringes: sex workers, homeless individuals, and the poor. They were easy to manipulate, easy to silence, and easy to forget. If a life was destroyed in the process, it wouldn't make headlines. For the CIA, that was an acceptable risk. The human toll of MKUltra is impossible to calculate. Thousands of people were experimented on. Some knew, many didn't. What unites their stories is the betrayal. They trusted doctors, wardens, or government institutions to help them. Instead, they were treated like lab rats in a secret Cold War experiment. By the early 1960s, MKUltra had left a trail of shattered lives across North America. And yet, the CIA was still not satisfied. They wanted bigger results, more extreme data, and a definitive answer to the question that had haunted them since the beginning. The search was about to reach its peak.
By the early 1960s, MKUltra had become a sprawling network of experiments spanning the United States, Canada, and even Europe. Sidney Gottlieb's small team had grown into a shadow bureaucracy within the CIA, coordinating dozens of subprojects under hundreds of codenames. The goal remained the same: total control over the human mind. But the methods were evolving. Scientists and doctors now combined LSD, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and electroshock in new permutations. Universities became testing grounds. Hospitals became laboratories. Even ordinary civilians, sometimes entire communities, could be targeted without their knowledge. Ironically, while MKUltra remained top secret, LSD began slipping into public consciousness. In 1962, a young chemist at Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland named Albert Hofmann accidentally discovered the hallucinogenic effects of the drug he had synthesized decades earlier. By the mid-1960s, LSD exploded into mainstream counterculture. Psychologists, writers, and musicians experimented with it openly. Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey became its high-profile evangelists, preaching mind expansion. The CIA watched with fascination. To them, LSD had always been a mind control tool, but now they could observe human behavior in uncontrolled, chaotic environments. College campuses, music festivals, and psychedelic communes became unwitting laboratories. MKUltra's leaders faced a paradox. LSD was more potent than anticipated. Subjects didn't always behave predictably. Instead of creating compliant agents, many experienced intense paranoia, panic, and psychological breakdowns. Yet from a scientific perspective, these failures still yielded data. Patterns emerged about susceptibility, dosage, and environmental influence. How the mind reacts under extreme conditions became more understandable, but at an extraordinary human cost. Alongside LSD, hypnosis experiments intensified. CIA researchers believed they could create Manchurian candidates, agents whose memories could be erased and overwritten with new instructions. Some volunteers underwent repeated hypnotic sessions while under drug influence. Others were subjected to sleep deprivation and isolation. The goal was to create a perfect operative, obedient, untraceable, and able to perform tasks without conscious recollection. In practice, success was rare. Many subjects suffered permanent psychological damage. Some refused to cooperate. Others broke down entirely. The human mind proved far more complex and far more fragile than the CIA had imagined. The program's peak coincided with a broader cultural moment. Psychedelics, mind-altering therapies, and countercultural experimentation blurred the line between CIA experimentation and societal curiosity. At the same time, the agency maintained strict secrecy. Even as LSD and hypnosis fascinated the public, MKUltra remained hidden. The contrast was striking. What Americans thought of as exploration, the government viewed as research. What the public called consciousness expansion, the CIA called intelligence preparation. By 1967, MKUltra had reached levels of intensity that were alarming even within the CIA. Volunteers were still being dosed without consent. Hospitals were still being used as laboratories. Safe houses continued their secretive operations. The human toll had become undeniable. Psychiatric patients were left irreparably harmed. Prisoners were traumatized. Some deaths, like Frank Olson's, remained unresolved. And yet the CIA pressed forward. They were obsessed with one question. If they could master the human mind, they would hold the ultimate power in a world of spies, enemies, and uncertain allegiances. MKUltra would not remain hidden forever. By the early 1970s, whistleblowers, journalists, and congressional investigations began to unravel the web. The CIA's most secretive program was about to be exposed to the public, and the nation would finally see the true extent of the human cost.
For nearly 2 decades, MKUltra operated in near total secrecy. But by the early 1970s, the first cracks began to appear. Investigative journalists started asking questions about the CIA's involvement in psychological experiments. Whistleblowers began to speak out. The agency had built an empire of secrecy, but even the most carefully hidden programs leave traces. In MKUltra's case, the traces were emails, memos, and accounts from doctors, scientists, and survivors, fragments that, when pieced together, told a story far darker than anyone had imagined. In 1975, the U.S. Senate formed a special investigative body known as the Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church. Its mission was to investigate abuses by the CIA, NSA, FBI, and other intelligence agencies. MKUltra quickly became a focus. The committee discovered that the CIA had spent millions of dollars on mind control experiments, often using unwitting citizens as test subjects. Hospitals, universities, and prisons had been co-opted to carry out experiments. Safe houses and secret labs dotted the country. Witnesses testified about LSD dosing, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and electroshock therapy, the human experiments that had left victims traumatized, and in some cases, dead. One of the most infamous aspects of MKUltra's exposure was the destruction of evidence.
In 1973, amid growing public scrutiny, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of nearly all MKUltra files. When investigators later requested records, they found little more than scraps, budget spreadsheets, a few memos, and partial reports. The full extent of the experiments, the names of subjects, the details of dosing, the precise methods used, remained lost. For the victims, this meant something worse than secrecy. It meant erasure. Their suffering was unrecorded, their abuse minimized, their stories invisible to the world. Despite the destruction of records, some survivors pursued justice. Lawsuits were filed against the CIA and institutions that had participated in MKUltra experiments. In 1988, the U.S. government agreed to a settlement with the surviving family members of Frank Olson, acknowledging the CIA's role in his death, though no one was ever criminally charged. Other victims received compensation, but many cases were dismissed due to lack of documentation or statutes of limitation. The settlements were symbolic, not restorative. They acknowledged wrongdoing, but could never undo the trauma inflicted on thousands. By the mid-1970s, MKUltra had become part of the public consciousness. Newspapers printed shocking headlines. CIA's mind control experiments on humans revealed. Televised reports discussed the abuses, and congressional hearings questioned officials who had overseen the programs. Yet, even in revelation, the CIA maintained plausible deniability. Officials insisted that most experiments were scientific research and within ethical bounds, though evidence suggested otherwise. The program had officially ended in the late 1960s, but the damage lingered. Victims suffered lifelong psychological scars. Families grieved in silence. And the American public began to question the ethics of a government willing to experiment on its own citizens in secret. MKUltra's exposure forced a reckoning. It revealed how fear and secrecy could warp an intelligence agency's mission. What began as a Cold War obsession with Soviet mind control methods had become a domestic nightmare, a violation of trust, and a moral catastrophe. The fallout reshaped policy. Oversight committees were established. Ethical guidelines for research were strengthened. But the specter of MKUltra never truly disappeared. Its methods, its ideas, and its unanswered questions continued to haunt both the intelligence community and the public imagination. The CIA had created a program to control the mind, but in the end, it could not control the truth. And when the truth emerged, it revealed a lesson far more terrifying than any chemical, any hypnotic suggestion, or any secret experiment. The human mind and human morality are far more fragile than anyone had imagined.
MKUltra may have officially ended in the 1970s, but its influence didn't vanish. The program seeped into the cultural consciousness in subtle and disturbing ways. Writers, musicians, and filmmakers drew inspiration from stories of mind control, secret experiments, and hallucinogens. Movies like The Manchurian Candidate suddenly felt less like fiction and more like a mirror of reality. Counterculture movements embraced LSD and psychedelic experimentation, sometimes unknowingly echoing the methods once hidden in CIA safe houses. For conspiracy theorists, MKUltra became a central node in a vast web of secret government activity. It was proof that intelligence agencies were capable of anything: extreme experimentation, clandestine operations, and moral compromise on a massive scale. Some believed the CIA had perfected mind control techniques, even if evidence suggested otherwise.
Rumors of Manchurian candidates persisted, fueling stories of sleeper agents, assassins, and unwitting operatives programmed to act without awareness. The truth was both more and less terrifying. The CIA never created perfect mind control operatives, but they did show how ordinary institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, could be co-opted to carry out experiments in secrecy. They showed how fear and ambition could justify moral compromise. The human cost of MKUltra remained hidden for decades. Survivors, some of them children, prisoners, or psychiatric patients, carried lifelong trauma. Memory loss, anxiety, depression, and social isolation were common outcomes. Psychologists and historians continue to study the program, asking difficult questions. What happens when ethics are subordinated to national security? How can a society prevent similar abuses in the future? The echoes of MKUltra remind us that scientific curiosity, unchecked by conscience, can become a weapon. And when that curiosity is combined with fear, secrecy, and power, the consequences are unpredictable and devastating. MKUltra also laid the groundwork for modern debates on surveillance, behavioral science, and covert influence. Government programs that manipulate information, experiment with social engineering, or conduct psychological operations all carry echoes of MKUltra's methodology. In an era of big data, targeted messaging, and mass influence campaigns, the questions raised by MKUltra are more relevant than ever. If a government could once manipulate minds through drugs and hypnosis, what does that mean in a world where algorithms shape perception, beliefs, and behavior? Perhaps the most enduring echo of MKUltra is moral. The program forced Americans and historians to ask what happens when fear overrides ethics, when curiosity turns into coercion, when power justifies abuse. MKUltra may have ended on paper, but the questions it raised about the boundaries of science, the fragility of the human mind, and the moral responsibility of governments continue to resonate. MKUltra remains a chilling reminder. History is written not only in wars and treaties, but in the unseen experiments conducted in secrecy, in the minds of victims, in the hidden corners of intelligence agencies, and in the stories that only surface decades later. The echoes of MKUltra persist, a shadow over the very institutions sworn to protect us.
If you enjoyed today's video, we thank you very much. Please like and subscribe to Rare Breed Chronicles. And let's dive into another story that defies the ordinary.